In this talk, I'm going to be looking at two small novels and what they may inform us about the history, culture and national psyche of Scotland, and also what these literary works may possibly tell us, not just about Scottish national idiosyncrasies, but perhaps also universal themes concerning human experience. I leave it up to the listener to judge whether there are any recognisable Russian characteristics here. The authors, Robert Louis Stevenson and James Hogg, are significant figures in the Scottish literary tradition, but maybe only Stevenson is internationally known. I am not a professional literary critic, nor a psychologist, so my approach tends towards the historical, but nevertheless, I trust my approach will provide some illumination and interest for you. My main argument is that these two works of literature should be seen in their historical context, and that in many ways they enlighten us about some of the historical, cultural and psychological tensions within Scottish society. And although one story was written early in the 19th century, it was published in 1824, and the other much later in 1886, they still find an echo today in contemporary Scottish society. It is my contention that the role that religion and alcohol have played in Scottish history has done much to shape the character of Scottish men, and the role that these two spirits, the holy and the alcoholic, have had in affecting the psychology of Scottish men in particular, and this is the main theme in both these books. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and drew inspiration for it with his own struggles with alcohol and from Scotland's religion of extreme Calvinism. He also drew inspiration from a real historical character, William Brody. By day, Brody was a respectable tradesman and a member of the town council, and part of his job in building cabinets was to install and repair their locks and other security mechanisms, and to repair door locks. At night, however, Brody became a burglar and a thief. He used his daytime job as a way to gain knowledge about the security mechanisms of his clients and to copy their keys. And as the foremost lockwright of the city, Brody was asked to work in the houses of many of the richest members of Edinburgh society. He used the money he made dishonestly to maintain his second life, which included a gambling habit and children to 5 mistresses. Stevenson also drew inspiration from an earlier literary work by James Hogg, who wrote the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner. James Hogg had, at the start of the 19th century, written an incredible story of a similar kind of character, one of outward respectability but inner corruption. Another ingredient in both stories is the centrality of Scottish religious belief. The Scottish Reformation had occurred in 1560, and the continuing historical struggles of religious identity from that time shaped a religion which was militant, harsh, and often unforgiving. However, it was embraced, often enthusiastically, by ordinary people, and it had a profound impact on Scottish mores and an influence which still resonates in Scottish society today. Robert Burns succinctly sums up this religious view in his poem Holy Willie's Prayer, and it commences with, O thou that in the heavens doth dwell, wha as pleases best thysel, sends ane to heaven and 10 to hell, a for thy glory, and no for ony good or ill they've done before thee. In English that just translates as God decides to save some people and condemns most others for no other reason than because it pleases God, and not because people have done either good or evil. The books were firmly in the Romantic Gothic tradition, a cultural movement which is in reaction against Enlightenment reason. The Romantic view perceived humans as more than just reasoning machines. Enlightenment views, of course, were a reaction against what was perceived as the fanaticism unleashed by faith without reason. In James Hogg's deeply subversive novel, Attacking Scottish Calvinism, the central character in the novel, Robert, is educated by his mother and adopted father, the Reverend Ringham, a particularly zealous and fanatical preacher, and is brought up to follow Ringham's radical Calvinism, which holds that only certain elect people are predestined to be saved by God. These chosen few will have a heavenly reward, regardless of how their lives are lived. The first part of the novel tells the story from an editorial and objective point of view, as an unfolding historical narrative. The second, subjective part of the novel consists of Robert's account of his own life in the form of a memoir, a very significant literary device for Protestant believers who are looking for signs of God's grace in their life. It purports to be a document part handwritten and part printed, which was found after his death. It recounts his childhood under the influence of the Reverend Ringham and goes on to explain how he became influenced by an enigmatic companion who says his name is Gilmartin. This stranger, who may possibly be the devil, appears after Ringham has declared Robert to be a member of the elect and so predestined to eternal salvation. Gilmartin, who is able to transform his appearances at will, soon directs all of Robert's pre-existing tendencies and beliefs to evil purposes, convincing him that it is his mission to cut sinners off with a sword, and that murder can be the correct course of action. From Gilmartin's boastings of the number of his adherents and the size of his dominions, Robert falls into the delusion that Gilmartin is in fact Peter the Great of Russia, who actually visited England about that time. The confession traces Robert's gradual decline into despair and madness, as his doubts about the righteousness of his cause are counteracted by Gilmartin's increasing domination over his life. Finally, Robert loses control over his own identity and even loses track of time. During these lost weeks and months, it is suggested that Gilmartin assumes Robert's appearance in order to commit further crimes. However, there are also suggestions in the text that Gilmartin is not an independent actor, but rather a figment of Robert's own imagination, and is simply an aspect of his own personality. As, for example, when he writes, "I feel as if I were the same person." The novel concludes with a return to the editor's narrative, which explains how the sinner's memoir was discovered in his grave. And here James Hogg appears as himself in this section and writes that the youth himself indulged rather more freely in the bottle than he had ever been seen to do before, clearly suggesting that perhaps many of Robert's troubles were as a result of drinking too much. The story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde follows similar themes on the duality of man. Hyde is often presented in films as a physical monster, but this is never the case in the original text. Dr. Jekyll is outwardly at least a respectable member of society who drinks a cocktail, which leads to a transformation of personality in a manner reminiscent of what occurs with many people when they have drank too much alcohol. Under the influence of alcohol, many people indulge in behaviour that they would never do when sober. And I believe this is what Stevenson is writing about in the novella. And he is expressing, in written form, his own personal struggle with strong drink and his typically Scottish Calvinist upbringing, a religion which scorned earthly pleasures and joys. Indeed, many allusions to this are revealed in the text. At the end of the story, his friends break into his laboratory only to find the body of Hyde wearing Jekyll's clothes, and apparently dead from suicide. Hyde was effectively a sociopath, evil, self-indulgent, and utterly uncaring to anyone but himself. Initially, Jekyll was able to control the transformations, but one night he became Hyde involuntarily in his sleep. At this point, Jekyll resolves to cease becoming Hyde, in other words, to stop drinking. However, The urge to drink the potion gripped Jekyll too strongly, and he drank the potion, thus releasing the repressed inner demon Hyde, who, furious at having been caged for so long, rushes out and commits murder. Horrified by his actions when under the influence, Jekyll tries more adamantly to stop the transformations, and for a time he is successful, and he engages in philanthropic work. And one day, while at a park, he considers how good a person he has become as a result of his deeds in comparison to others, believing himself to be redeemed. However, this is very sinful in religious terms, as it is contrary to the Calvinist view that we are all sinners and we cannot be saved unless by God and by grace alone. Dr. Jekyll left a suicide note which ends by saying, "I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end." And with these words, both the document and the novella come to a close. The novella is often interpreted as an examination of the duality of human nature, usually expressed as an inner struggle between good and evil. In Freudian theory, the thoughts and desires banished to the unconscious mind motivate the behavior of the conscious mind. If someone banishes all evil to the unconscious mind in an attempt to be wholly and completely good, it can result in the development of a Mr. Hyde type aspect of that person's character. This is because in Christianity, pride, to be considered oneself as without sin or without evil, is the greatest sin, as it is the precursor to evil itself. In his discussion of the novel, Vladimir Nabokov argues that the good versus evil view of the novel is misleading, as Jekyll himself is not, at least by Victorian standards, a morally good person. And I would agree with him. It is not a classic binary struggle between good and evil, but rather it is about an individual's struggle with himself and his addiction, and in this case, with alcohol. Numerous quotes from the novelette attest to this interpretation. For example, "There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy." And again, "I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double at once, with infinite risk of death, to treble the amount, and these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accidents, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse." And again he wrote, "I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading character of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled and a more furious propensity to ill." Now it seems pretty clear, I would argue, that these quotes suggest that this is someone writing about a struggle with alcohol, a struggle that many in Scotland have known and experienced over the years, and still do today. I recognise these struggles from my own family and friends. These tensions in Scottish culture between a morally very repressive religion and the historical abuse of strong drink, mostly whisky, perhaps explains much about the Scottish male character. The abuse of alcohol often releases behaviour which in normal circumstances would not be done. The cry, "It was not me, it was the drink," is a remark often made and heard. The two spirits, the holy and the alcoholic, poured into the empty souls of men, when combined with Scotland's often tragic history of collective and personal suffering, has helped shape a national personality, which is often at the same time pious, righteous, and often despondent. It is certainly pessimistic, but occasionally it is interspersed with outbreaks of glorious optimism, only to be followed by the inevitable hangover of reality.